One rainy afternoon, three little girls step into a luxury store, not to shop, but to escape the cold. They're soaked, shivering, and holding a letter with just one name. But instead of compassion, they're humiliated. What no one expects is that the video of this moment will reach the eyes of a billionaire, a man who recognizes something that was never meant to be seen again. A handmade necklace from a past he's never truly escaped. Who are these girls? And why does one of them wear the last gift he gave to a woman he lost 7 years ago? Stay with us to uncover a story of injustice, second chances, and a love that refuses to fade. The moment Skylar stepped onto the gleaming white floor of Mirror Vogue, dragging her soaked sneakers behind her sisters, she instinctively pulled Sadie closer and pressed Stella's hand tighter into her own. They had rehearsed it, over and over again, in whispers at night, huddled in the corner of the shelter. The words they'd say if they found the store, if someone opened the door, if someone asked them who they were. But now, standing beneath the brutal perfection of chandeliers and mannequins dressed like queens, the plan crumbled. They looked completely out of place. Three drenched, trembling girls holding a crumpled envelope with smeared ink and one hope: Mr. Grayson. Skylar stepped forward, clearing her throat. "Excuse me," she tried, but her voice cracked. No one at the reception desk turned. A tall man walked past with a tablet, looked at them, and kept walking. Stella sniffled, the sound sharp against the sterile silence. Then the clicking started. The hard, sharp rhythm of high heels descending marble stairs, growing louder, angrier. And then she appeared. Madison Crane. Her gaze traveled from their wet hair to the puddle forming beneath their feet, and her expression shifted instantly from confusion to contempt. "What is this?" Madison's voice snapped like a whip, slicing through the air. Skylar stepped forward instinctively, shielding her sisters. "We're looking for Mr. Grayson," she said, holding up the envelope. "Our mom, she told us to give this to him." Madison didn't even glance at the letter. Instead, her eyes zeroed in on the Persian rug just past the doorway, where the girl's feet had left muddy prints. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered. She turned to the security guard near the corner. "Who let them in? Why are they inside?" The man shrugged and looked away, clearly unwilling to get involved. Sadie coughed harshly, and Stella began to cry softly, but Madison didn't flinch. Her eyes returned to Skylar. "This is a place of business, not a homeless shelter. Do you have any idea how much that rug cost?" Skylar blinked. "We didn't mean... That rug was imported from Morocco," Madison cut in, voice rising. "And now look at it. You three just dragged half the gutter onto it." She pointed down, her perfectly manicured finger trembling with fury. "Clean it, now." Skylar froze, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Sadie looked up at her, eyes wide and pleading. Stella buried her face in her sleeve. Madison wasn't bluffing. Her arms were crossed, her stance as firm as the glass storefront that had once felt like salvation. "I said clean it," she repeated, slower this time, "or all three of you can wait outside in the rain until your imaginary Mr. Grayson decides to appear." The room was silent. No one moved to stop her. No one offered help. Skylar bent down slowly, tears stinging her eyes as she pulled her thin, soaked sleeve over her hand. The velvet of her sweatshirt darkened further as it dragged across the ornate rug. It didn't clean anything, it only smeared the wet dirt into the fibers, but Madison watched with cruel satisfaction. "There, now at least you're doing something useful." Skylar didn't look up. She could feel every pair of eyes in the showroom on her back. She could hear Sadie's breath hitch, the way it always did when she was about to cry but tried not to. But Stella's quiet whimper broke something in her. "Enough!" Madison barked after a minute. "Get them out of here, they're ruining the entrance." The security guard hesitated, his jaw tight, but one look from Madison was enough. He took a step toward them. "Come on, girls," he said, too soft for someone who had done nothing moments before. Skylar helped Sadie to her feet, took Stella's hand, and led them toward the door. Their shoes squelched against the marble as they walked. Madison didn't even glance at them again. "Fakes," she muttered under her breath. "People will do anything for attention these days." As they passed the threshold, the automatic doors opened soundlessly, and then came the slap of rain, colder now, like the weather itself was ashamed to welcome them back. The girls didn't speak. Skylar kept her head down, gripping the wet envelope, its contents likely ruined beyond recognition. Behind them, the world of warmth and wealth resumed, as if they'd never been there. A shopper stepped around the puddle with a grimace. A man laughed near the counter. Skylar didn't look back. Outside, the rain didn't let up. It soaked through their socks, their jackets, their hope. Stella sneezed. Sadie leaned into Skylar's arm. The letter had no address anymore, only blurred ink and the faint shape of their mother's handwriting. Skylar stared at it, then shoved it into her pocket like it didn't matter, because maybe it didn't. Maybe Grayson was just a name, like the ones in fairy tales. She remembered their mother's words again. "If anything happens, find Grayson Hale. Go to Mira Vogue. He'll help you." But help had never come. The only thing they'd found was a woman in heels who made them feel smaller than they already were. Stella sat down on the cold steps, hugging her knees. Skylar looked up, rain dripping from her lashes, and tried to believe that something good would come next, even if she had no reason to. They didn't know they were being watched from a window above. They didn't know the video was already spreading. All they knew was that the world had turned them away. Above them, behind the tinted glass of the top-floor office, someone stood still. He had watched the scene play out, not live, but replayed in silence twice, 3 times, from a forwarded message. The girls didn't know his name. They didn't know the lines on his face, or the way his hands tightened at the sight of the necklace around Skylar's neck. They didn't know that years ago he'd given that same pendant to a woman who vanished with his heart. And they couldn't know that in that very moment he was already picking up the phone. But that would come later. For now, the only truth was this. 3 children had been thrown into the rain for the crime of needing help. And as Skylar pulled Stella into her lap and wrapped her arm around Sadie's shoulders, the carpet behind the glass dried beneath warm air vents, its shame erased, while theirs stayed soaked into their skin. Grayson Hale hadn't planned on checking his inbox that morning. Not personally, anyway. Normally, the first 30 minutes of his day were walled off, quiet, controlled, full of espresso and silence. But one of his assistants had knocked twice and slipped a phone into his hand with trembling fingers. "It's going viral, sir," she said, not meeting his eyes. "And you should see it." The video began mid-shout, Madison Crane's voice unmistakable even without the visual, and he barely blinked as it played. But when the camera angle shifted and the frame caught the face of the eldest girl, soaked and shaking but standing her ground, something inside him shifted. The clip wasn't long, just under 90 seconds, but it felt endless. The second time he watched it, he paused at the 5-second mark. A close-up of the girl's collarbone, a thin cord, and dangling from it, unmistakable to him alone, the bronze hand-carved pendant in the shape of an autumn leaf. He dropped the phone. He picked it up slowly, eyes locked on the frozen image. The leaf, simple and weathered with age, had once been part of a matching set, made by a Brooklyn sculptor he and Elena used to visit on their walks after work. He gave it to her on the day she left Hale & Co. No goodbye kiss, no dramatic scene, just a quiet handshake and a gift offered with a tremble he'd hoped she didn't notice. She had taken it with her and vanished. For years, he'd told himself it didn't matter, that she owed him no explanation. That love, real or not, was allowed to end in silence. But seeing it now, around the neck of a child with Elena's same chin and guarded expression, cracked something open he didn't know was still whole. The media storm, the headlines, the PR panic swirling around Madison's cruelty, none of it mattered. That necklace wasn't a coincidence. It was a message, one meant for him, even if they hadn't known they were sending it. His board of directors had assembled in the meeting room across the hall, voices muffled behind soundproof glass. They were preparing for damage control, calculating whether to fire Madison or protect her, debating liability, loss, optics. But Grayson remained seated in his private office, unmoving. The image of the girls, soaked and shivering, replayed on loop inside his mind, not just because of the necklace, though that was the anchor. It was the look in the girls' eyes, that defiant, wounded stare, like someone who'd been let down too many times to still believe in kindness, but refused to stop hoping. That stare looked exactly like Elena's when she used to challenge him in meetings, refusing to nod along to corporate games. It was her spirit, not just her DNA, staring back at him through a TikTok clip with thousands of comments, and he couldn't ignore it. Not again, not this time. A knock on the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Mr. Hale," said Angela, his senior advisor, "Crisis management wants to move forward with the public statement. Do you want me to approve the draft?" Grayson stood, slow and mechanical. "No. Tell them to hold everything." Angela blinked. "Sir?" He looked past her, out the glass window, to the city that had swallowed Elena whole, and now tried to spit her children out in shame. "I need everything you can find on Elena Brooks. Last known address, employment history, anything." Angela hesitated. "We ran that background years ago. She disappeared." He turned fully to her. "Then run it again." There was steel in his voice, the kind that didn't entertain negotiation. "And I want full access to the store's security tapes from the past week. I want to know how long they were standing there before Madison got involved." "And who saw them?" Angela nodded, retreating quickly. Grayson sat back down, exhaling slowly, then reached for the phone. His fingers hovered over the screen. There were numbers he hadn't dialed in years, names he'd deleted out of spite and pain. He typed in Elena, just to see if anything remained. Nothing. The only remaining trail was that necklace, proof that she'd kept something. Proof that she hadn't thrown it all away. Maybe she'd tried to reach out and failed. Maybe she had her reasons, but no matter what the truth was, those girls were hers. And if they were hers, they were his problem now, not legally, not even morally at first glance. But in his gut, he knew he couldn't turn away. If he did, he'd never sleep again. He had ignored Elena's pain once, buried it under ambition and pride. This time, the price was too visible. It had faces, names, wet socks and bruised hope. He wasn't sure what he'd find when he did find them, but he would. The third time he watched the video, he paused not on the necklace, but on Skylar's face. Her jaw tightened as Madison yelled, and she moved subtly to block her sisters from the outburst. Protective, brave, already carrying weight no child should. Grayson leaned forward, rewinding the clip just a few seconds, memorizing the way she glanced down at Sadie, then back up at the adult towering over her. He whispered the name to himself. Skylar. He didn't know the other two names yet, but he would. That girl, who was still a child, who still had time to be saved, was more than a symbol of his past. She was a call to action. He had resources. He had reach. And for the first time in years, he had a reason that wasn't profit or power. As the final frame of the video lingered on screen, Grayson stood up, heart racing. He needed to know who they were. He needed to see them, and he would. Grayson had walked through hundreds of unfamiliar doors in his life. Boardrooms, penthouses, courtrooms, even charity shelters when it suited his company's image. But none of them compared to the peeling wooden door of room 204 in a decaying boarding house in the far edge of Brooklyn. Dressed in worn jeans and a thrifted coat that smelled faintly of cedar, he looked more like a volunteer than a billionaire. He had traced the address from an old hotel employment record buried beneath layers of rejections and red tape. Paperwork Madison Crane had conveniently buried. Now, standing at the threshold of a forgotten life, he heard a weak cough from inside and then silence. He knocked. The door opened slowly, just enough for him to see a pale face, hollow cheeks, and dark eyes that blinked in suspicion before turning to confusion. "Can I help you?" Elena Brooks asked, voice raw and tired. Grayson's throat tightened. He hadn't seen her in nearly 7 years, and in that moment, he wasn't sure if it was mercy or cruelty that she didn't recognize him. "It's me," he said, his voice cracking. "Elena, it's Grayson." For a second, Elena didn't move. Her hand stayed on the doorknob, knuckles pale, her brows furrowed, as if the name had to travel through a fog of exhaustion and disbelief to reach her. "Grayson," she repeated, incredulous. "What? Why?" She took a staggering step back and coughed again, hard enough to bend at the waist. Grayson instinctively reached out, but she waved him off, regaining her balance slowly. "You shouldn't be here." Her voice was sharper now, defensive, with a layer of old pain. He stepped into the room anyway, gently closing the door behind him. It smelled of cheap menthol and vinegar, the scent of someone trying to stay alive with what little they had. He looked at her, really looked, and the reality hit him like a punch to the gut. She was thinner, fragile, but her eyes still held the same iron. "I saw them," he said softly. "Skylar, Sadie, Stella, outside Mirror Vogue." Elena's face crumpled. "You saw that?" she whispered, sinking slowly into a chair. "Everyone did," he replied. "But I saw more than that." She shook her head, overwhelmed. "You shouldn't have come." In the narrow hallway just outside the room, 3 small girls sat with paper and crayons. None of them spoke. None of them looked up. Stella traced quiet loops on a folded magazine page. Sadie balanced a crayon between her fingers like a prayer stick, and Skylar watched the door through her reflection in a dusty mirror. It was as if they knew what was happening on the other side, like the tension in their mother's voice translated into an instinct to remain still. Grayson could see them through the small gap in the doorframe and felt a strange guilt gnawing at his chest. "They're quiet," he murmured. Elena gave a bitter laugh, followed by another fit of coughing. "They've learned not to make noise unless absolutely necessary," she said, "because noise means attention, and attention hurts." Grayson sat across from her. "Why didn't you reach out? Why didn't you come back?" "Ma," she lifted her gaze, tired but sharp. "Do you really think I didn't try?" She opened a drawer and pulled out a bundle of folded letters, rubber-banded together. "I wrote, I called, I even came to the office once, but your assistant, Madison, told me you had moved on." Grayson's jaw tightened. He took the letters in shaking hands, flipping through pages of unsent truths. Elena watched him with a strange calm. "I lost my job, then my housing, then my insurance. I took whatever I could get. Cleaned floors, changed sheets. Took night shifts so I could be there when the girls woke up. I wasn't looking for charity, Grayson. I just wanted to matter. I wanted someone to listen." She coughed again, this time slower, deeper. "And now, you show up after all this time and want to play hero." Her voice cracked, not from anger, but from something worse, disappointment. "I didn't come to fix everything," Grayson said quietly. "I came because I should have been there the first time. I came because I saw the look in Skylar's eyes, and I saw you in it." Eleanor closed her eyes. She was tired, and the years had not been kind. "I don't need your pity," she whispered. "I need my dignity." There was a silence so thick neither of them could fill it. Outside, the girls were still silent. Skylar stood first, walking toward the door, pausing just short of it, not knocking. Her fingers hovered near the frame, like a question waiting to be answered. Grayson watched her through the crack and felt the weight of every missed moment, every blocked letter. Every second he'd convinced himself Elena had walked away, without reason. Inside the room, Elena leaned back against the chair, her breath shallow, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I fought so hard to protect them from the world," she said, "but I couldn't protect them from you not being there." That, more than anything, landed. Grayson lowered his head, folding the bundle of letters like a relic. "I didn't know," he said. "I let someone else decide the truth for me." Elena looked up, eyes glistening but empty. "And now that you know?" He looked toward the hallway again, toward the children who barely knew he existed. "Now, I want to know them." Elena didn't smile. She didn't nod. But for a moment she let her guard fall. Brooklyn smelled like mold, medicine, and muffled hope. Grayson Hale, still dressed like someone ordinary, sat across from a woman who had once lit up every room in his life. Now she coughed until her voice broke and her back ached. She wouldn't accept his help, not yet. She wouldn't let him rewrite the past so easily. "Where were you?" she asked finally, "when I needed you?" There was no accusation in her voice, only truth, the kind that cut deeper than blame. And for the first time, Grayson Hale didn't offer a defense. He didn't excuse. He simply looked her in the eyes, and in that long silence, he finally understood. He was the one who disappeared. Skylar arrived at the Hale and Comber headquarters with no warning, her tiny sneakers damp from the early dew, her coat zipped all the way up, and a piece of folded paper clutched tight in her hand like it was a passport to another world. The security guard didn't know what to do with her at first. Children didn't just walk into high-rise buildings alone, especially not with eyes that steady and posture that still. "Do you have an appointment?" he asked, clearly uncomfortable. Skylar shook her head. "I came to see Grayson Hale." The name wasn't whispered. It was stated like a fact, like gravity. The receptionist tried calling upstairs, but Skylar never moved from where she stood, her eyes fixed on the hallway leading to the elevators. She didn't ask for water or food or help. She simply waited. When Grayson finally stepped into the lobby and saw her, small, serious, holding a wrinkled drawing, he stopped walking. He said nothing. She said nothing. There was no dramatic reunion, no sweeping gestures. Just one child standing still, waiting to be noticed for something other than being pitied. Grayson approached slowly, knees bending as he knelt down beside her. He didn't reach for the drawing, didn't ask for it. He just looked at her face, searching for some clue, some thread that could tell him what had brought her here without her mother. "You came alone?" he asked gently. Skylar nodded once. "Mum's sleeping. She had a bad night." He nodded in return, acknowledging her bravery without making it a spectacle. She unfolded the paper and handed it to him with both hands, her fingers releasing it like it was something sacred. "I made this," she said quietly. Grayson looked down. 3 red lines drawn with deliberate strokes, a rug in the center, 3 girls beside it, each with large eyes and stick-thin arms. The tallest of them was crouched, one hand on the floor, the other wiping. "That's me," Skylar said, pointing. "I was cleaning. But now, it's just a game." She smiled faintly, as if trying to make the memory less painful by renaming it. Grayson felt something crack inside him, something old and armored. He hadn't cried in years, not for death, not for betrayal, not even for loneliness. But this broke him. Still kneeling, he held the drawing as if it were made of glass. "You drew this all by yourself?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Skylar nodded. "Sadie helped with the eyes. She's good with faces." Grayson smiled at the mention of her sisters, feeling the invisible threads connecting them all tighten slightly. "Do they know you're here?" he asked. "No," she said. "I didn't want to wake them. I just needed to know if it was real, that you meant it when you said you wanted to know us." Grayson closed his eyes for a brief second. The weight of that sentence pressed down on him harder than any boardroom negotiation. "I did mean it," he said, "and I still do." She looked at him as if measuring the truth behind his words. Then, with the blunt honesty of a child, she asked, "Can I see your office?" Not out of curiosity, but out of a deeper need to see if he would really let her in. He stood and held out his hand. She took it. Together they crossed the lobby, eyes following them from every corner, but Grayson didn't care. The elevator doors opened, and he hesitated before stepping in. This was the line, the boundary between who he'd been and who he might become. A man who didn't know how to fix everything, but who was ready to show up. The ride-up was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not heavy, not hollow, just full of possibility. When they reached the top floor, he led her down the hallway, past walls lined with awards and photos of a man she wouldn't recognize. In his office, she walked in without hesitation, hopping onto the couch and placing the drawing on the coffee table like it belonged there. "Is this where you make big decisions?" she asked. "Sometimes," he replied. "And today?" She tilted her head. "Today," he said, sitting beside her, "I think I made the biggest one." She didn't ask what he meant. She just nodded and pulled a broken crayon from her pocket, placing it beside the drawing. "In case you want to change the story later," she whispered. Grayson stared at it, the fragment of red wax, dull and worn down, and felt his chest tighten again. This wasn't just a visit, it was an invitation, an offer, a test, and he wasn't about to fail it. For the first time, he didn't see Skylar as a problem to solve or a guilt to bury. He saw her as a person, a child with scars, yes, but also with enough strength to walk into the tallest building in Manhattan alone, clutching the truth in crayon. She hadn't asked him to fix anything. She hadn't begged for help. She had simply come to see if she was worth being seen. Grayson knew what that meant, and so, for the first time, he let her in. Into the elevator, into the office, into a life he hadn't realized was so empty until she stepped into it. Skylar had appeared at the building of Hale & Co., unannounced, holding a drawing. She waited for Grayson in the lobby without a word. The drawing had 3 red lines, a rug, and 3 girls with wide eyes. He knelt beside her, silently. Skylar pointed to the tallest one and said, "That's me, cleaning. But now, it's just pretend." Grayson hadn't cried in years, but something in those childlike lines shattered him. For the first time, he brought her inside, into an elevator, into an office, into a life. He didn't yet know what to do with it all, but he knew one thing: he wanted to try. Grayson stood behind the glass wall of the executive conference room, watching Madison Crane enter with the same poised gait she always had, heels clicking, chin lifted, ego wrapped around her like perfume. But today, she didn't look invincible. She looked cornered. 2 of his legal advisors sat at the end of the table, folders in front of them thick with emails, audio transcriptions, HR complaints, and financial reports. Grayson didn't sit. He stayed standing, arms crossed, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle her. "Close the door, Madison," he said. She hesitated, then obeyed. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked, voice neutral. She gave a shallow shrug, performing nonchalance. "I imagine it has something to do with that ridiculous video circulating." He didn't blink. "It has to do with everything before that video, including every lie you told to bury a woman who never did anything to you but exist." He slid the folder toward her. "Start reading." Madison's hands were steady, but her eyes flickered as she scanned the pages. First came the internal emails she rerouted. Then the falsified report claiming Eleanor had breached confidentiality, when in fact she'd simply asked for a transfer. Next, a damning audio clip. Madison's voice instructing a junior staffer to lose any letters addressed to Mr. Hale from someone named Brooks. She didn't flinch, but the color in her face shifted. "This was personal for you, wasn't it?" Grayson asked, still standing. "You thought removing her would elevate you." Madison exhaled sharply. She manipulated you, played the part of the sweet, humble worker. You couldn't even see it. Her voice cracked beneath the varnish of control. I gave everything to this company, and she just walked in and... And what? Grayson snapped. Stole your spotlight, or reminded you that you never had it? Madison opened her mouth, but no defense came. The silence that followed was more damning than any piece of evidence. You're going to confess, Grayson said, voice cold now. Publicly. Today. Madison scoffed. You can't make me... I can destroy you, he cut in. But I'm offering you an exit with the last ounce of dignity you have left. He laid down the terms. A press conference at noon. A full statement, drafted by legal, where she would admit to discrimination, obstruction, and corporate misconduct. No chance to spin it. No pre-approved interview follow-ups. And if I refuse, she asked, then you'll be charged with misuse of company funds and obstruction of internal investigation. His attorney replied, we have everything we need. Madison's shoulders sagged slightly. The fall was coming. She had climbed this empire on stilettos sharpened by ambition, but the foundation had always been paper thin. Fine, she muttered. You want a villain? I'll be your villain. Grayson leaned forward, eyes narrowing. You made a child clean the floor with her sleeve, Madison. You don't get to choose what you are anymore. By the time the press conference aired, the damage was already in motion. Social media had latched onto the scandal like a wildfire. Hashtags boycotting Mira Vogue trended globally. Public outrage wasn't just about Madison, it was about every child, every working mother, every ignored letter, and every system that allowed someone like her to rise unchecked. Investors pulled out. The board panicked. Grayson didn't flinch. He had made his choice. Half the executive leadership was removed by the end of the week. A third-party audit began immediately. For every email Madison deleted, there were 2 that someone else archived. And while reporters tried to get statements from Grayson himself, he said only one thing: no company should thrive on cruelty, not under my name. It wasn't for applause, it was restitution. But still, something in him remained unsettled, because public justice could never heal private wounds. He sat alone later that night in his office, the lights dimmed, the building quieter than usual. In front of him lay the drawing Skylar had given him, 3 red stripes, 3 girls. He traced the crayon lines with his finger, wondering how many more of Elena's moments had been stolen, how many nights she sat by a mailbox that never delivered answers. Firing Madison, dismantling the board, exposing the truth. None of it rewound time. None of it gave those girls back their innocence. He could fix the company, but he couldn't fix what he'd failed to see for 7 years. That was the bitter truth. Justice was only the first step, not the final act. And the woman who mattered most to him still hadn't said his name without pain in her voice. While the girls quietly began taking space in Grayson's heart, Madison Crane faced her downfall. He confronted her with recordings, buried emails, and fabricated reports. Not only had Madison sabotaged Elena in the past, but she had also blocked every attempt Elena made to reach out. Letters, calls, even visits. Her public confession became the scandal of the year. The store faced boycotts. Grayson eventually fired half the board, but even he knew that wasn't enough. Public justice didn't mend private wounds. The chasm between him and Elena was still deeper than any scandal. Elena's body trembled slightly as she walked across the small living room, her breath ragged from the lingering fever that clung to her like wet fabric. It had been a hard night. Coughing fits that racked her chest, dizziness that blurred her vision. She hadn't planned to speak about the past. Not tonight, but something about the way Grayson sat there, quiet, still, not as a CEO but as a man humbled, made her reconsider. Without a word, she knelt beside the rickety dresser, slid open a bottom drawer, and pulled out a small, battered shoebox covered in faded stickers and duct tape. She walked it over slowly, placed it in front of him, and sat back down. "I was going to burn them," she said, her voice rough but steady. Grayson didn't ask what was inside. He just stared at the box. "But I couldn't. Not because I thought you'd ever read them, but because I needed to believe someone might have wanted to." She leaned her head against the couch, eyes fluttering closed. "Now I want you to see what silence really costs." Grayson opened the box with deliberate hands, as if touching something sacred. Inside were dozens of folded papers, some with water stains, some scribbled on hotel notepads, others written with shaking hands on old stationery. The first was dated just a week after Elena left Hale & Co. He opened it, and the words stared back at him like echoes from a timeline he never lived. "Grayson, I didn't want to leave like that." It began. She had been pregnant. She had been scared. She thought he might want to know, might want to be there. She had written about her cravings, her appointments, the fear she carried every day, wondering if she'd made a mistake by not pushing harder to reach him. "I left because I thought I'd be a burden," one letter read. "But I still hoped. Every day, I hoped you'd find me." Grayson read on, page after page, his hands beginning to tremble. Every letter was a quiet act of love, even when hurt bled through the ink. He wasn't just reading her pain, he was reading his absence. He looked up at her, still resting with her eyes closed, and the weight of the letters in his lap felt like the weight of the years between them. "You tried to reach me," he finally whispered. Elena didn't respond, but her fingers curled slightly into the blanket draped over her legs. "Madison made sure I never saw them," he continued. "She blocked everything. I didn't know. I thought you were done with me." Her eyes opened, faint and tired but steady. "I wasn't," she said quietly. "I was just trying to survive." There was no venom in her voice, no dramatics, just the truth. Grayson felt shame crawl through his chest like ice. "I should have looked harder. I should have known something wasn't right. I let silence stand in for an answer that never existed." Elena shrugged gently. "People believe what's easiest when they're hurt. I did too." He stood, pacing the room with one of the letters still clutched in his hand. "I wasn't ready back then," he admitted. "I was too buried in everything, expectations, pride, the company. But I never stopped thinking about you." He turned to face her, eyes glassy. "And now, reading these, it's not just regret I feel, it's grief. Grief for the moments I never got to live, for the first time you felt them kick, for their first words, their birthdays. I wasn't there. I didn't know how to be." Elena's gaze didn't waver. "But you're here now," she said. "They see it, they feel it. That counts for more than you think." Grayson walked back to her, crouched down and placed the letters back into the box. "I'm sorry," he said, eyes locked on hers. "Not just for what happened, but for every letter that sat unopened. For every day I didn't fight to find you." Then the moment that changed everything, he reached for her hand. It was small, cold, but she didn't pull away. He didn't speak again. He just sat beside her, his hand in hers, the box between them, like a quiet memorial to all that had been lost, and a fragile symbol of what might still be salvaged. Elena's eyes searched his face for a long time, and what she saw must have been enough. She didn't say the words he longed to hear. Instead, she smiled softly, not with her mouth, but with her eyes. It wasn't forgiveness wrapped in sentiment, it was recognition, an understanding that while the damage couldn't be erased, the intention to repair had finally arrived. That mattered. Sometimes the heart doesn't need a declaration, just a presence. Elena, in a night of weakness and fever, gave Grayson a box filled with yellowed papers. Inside were letters she had written in the months after leaving the company, confessions of fear, news of an unexpected pregnancy, quiet hopes that he would want to know. Grayson read each word as if they were knives and embraces at once. For the first time, his tears were not of shame or guilt, but of love. A late love, but a living one. He asked for forgiveness. Eleanor simply smiled with her eyes, without a word. Sometimes silence is the most honest yes there is. Grayson didn't wait for Elena's approval before setting things in motion. Something in her silence, in that unspoken yes from days earlier, had ignited a quiet urgency in him. Not out of guilt, not even redemption, but because for the first time in years, he wanted something more than control. He wanted to build a place that could breathe, where nothing needed to be earned to be deserved. The house he chose wasn't ostentatious, but it was solid, warm, and safe. Before the moving truck even arrived, he'd already furnished 3 small bedrooms, each with a bed that didn't match the others, but looked like it could be someone's favorite. He ordered towels, not generic ones, but personalized. Stella, Sadie, Skylar. The embroidery was crooked on one of them. He kept it anyway. He stocked a pantry with everything he remembered Elena once liked, plus things he imagined the girls might want. Marshmallows, cocoa, cereal with cartoon animals. He didn't know how to do any of this perfectly, but perfection wasn't the point anymore. When he looked around the empty house, waiting for them to arrive, he didn't see a project. He saw a promise he hadn't known how to make until now. The drive to the countryside was quiet. Elena kept her eyes forward, her hand resting gently on Stella's head as the girl dozed in her lap. Skylar sat by the window, alert, gripping her little notebook like a shield, while Sadie hummed a song no one recognized. Grayson drove without saying much. He wasn't trying to impress or explain. The closer they got, the more the girls seemed to loosen, like they could sense the shift in the air. When they pulled into the driveway, the car hadn't even stopped before Stella's tiny voice rang out from the back seat. "Is that our house?" Grayson turned slightly, a cautious smile forming. "Only if you want it to be." No one replied. Instead, Sadie grabbed her sister's hand and jumped out. Skylar lingered, eyes narrowed, scanning the porch, the door, the welcome mat that read, "You belong here." It wasn't just a house to her. It was a test. She had failed trust before, but still she followed. Inside, the girls scattered like marbles. Sadie found the couch first and curled up beside a plush stuffed bear, squeezing it to her chest with the kind of instinct that only came from never having owned anything long enough to believe it was hers. Stella ran room to room, declaring everything she saw like she was narrating a miracle. "There's a kitchen and a closet and a bathroom with a duck soap." Then she turned, saw the window in one of the rooms and squealed, "There's a tree! I can see a tree!" Her voice cracked like joy hadn't quite remembered how to come out yet. Grayson stood in the hallway, watching, his throat tightening. He hadn't expected the girls to settle so quickly, even in fragments. He thought there would be fear, hesitation, tears. But maybe what they needed wasn't explanation. Maybe it was simply space to breathe, to exist without condition. Elena sat on the edge of a chair, silent but not distant. She looked around at the small signs of thoughtfulness, the towels, the toys, the cereal, and something softened in her eyes. She didn't say thank you, she just let herself breathe for once. Skylar was the last to explore. She walked with measured steps, as if the floor might vanish beneath her. Her eyes flicked from doorway to doorway, stopping at the bookshelf, the framed photos of trees and oceans, clearly store-bought placeholders, but still meant to be welcoming. She didn't touch anything at first. Then she entered the smallest room and saw her name, stitched in blue, on a towel laid across a chair. She touched it like it might dissolve. It didn't. "That's your room if you want," Grayson said from behind her. She didn't jump. She'd known he was there. She turned to face him. "Why did you do this?" she asked, not rudely, not even suspiciously, just searching. He paused. "Because no one should have to earn love, not when they've already survived everything they shouldn't have had to." Skylar nodded once. It wasn't agreement. Not yet. But it wasn't rejection either. She took the towel and placed it on the bed. Then she sat down, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked like a child resting, not planning an escape. That night, Elena tucked the girls in with quiet precision. She hadn't done that in weeks, not with any real sense of peace. Sadie slept with the bear under one arm and her thumb in her mouth. Stella refused to change into pajamas because she didn't want to stop jumping on the bed. Eventually, she collapsed in a pile of blankets, giggling into sleep. Skylar lay awake a little longer, watching the ceiling. Elena stroked her forehead and whispered, "It's okay to trust a little, just a little." Skylar didn't reply, but she didn't move away either. In the other room, Grayson was rereading one of Eleanor's letters, not to punish himself, but because he didn't want to forget. He wanted to carry it with him, the truth of what had been lost, so he would never again take for granted what might still be found. He wasn't looking for a thank you. He just hoped they would stay. He hoped that one day this wouldn't feel temporary to them, that maybe in some fragile, messy way it could start to feel like theirs. On their first night in the new house, something unspoken settled between them all. The girls didn't cry. They didn't ask to leave. There were no locks on the doors, no whispered goodbyes. Just 3 children, warm and full, wrapped in mismatched blankets, in rooms with their names on towels. Stella had shouted with awe at the sight of a tree through the window, like it was the first one she'd ever seen. Sadie had drifted to sleep on the couch with a bear she now claimed as hers. Skylar had tiptoed through the hallways, wary but willing. And for the first time in what felt like forever, they all fell asleep, not with fear, but with full stomachs, dry hair, and the faint belief that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't charity. Maybe this was home. Elena didn't cry when the doctor laid out the diagnosis. She nodded, politely, as though discussing a bill or the weather. But inside, she was disintegrating. The doctor's words were clear. The progression of her condition had accelerated. The current medications weren't enough. She would need long-term treatment, possibly surgery, and strict periods of rest, none of which were compatible with night shifts, school runs, and 3 girls who needed her for everything. She thanked the doctor, asked for the written instructions, and left the office holding the papers like they were a secret she could fold, small enough to disappear. In the car, she kept her face turned to the window. Grayson offered to drive. She said nothing. The silence between them wasn't angry, but it buzzed with something unspeakable. She didn't want his pity. She didn't want to become a problem he solved. When they pulled into the driveway, she got out quickly and told him, "It's fine, just adjustments." He looked at her, unconvinced. What kind of adjustments require hiding tears in a clinic bathroom? But she was already walking inside, holding the folder tight to her chest like a barrier. She thought the girls didn't notice. She was wrong. Skylar had heard more than Elena knew. She hadn't meant to listen, but when you've spent your life learning how to read the room before the room reads you, eavesdropping becomes a survival skill. She had slipped out of the kids' waiting area under the pretense of needing the restroom, but instead lingered by the cracked door as the doctor spoke in hushed clinical tones. Skylar didn't understand every term: invasive, respiratory compromise, surgical evaluation, but she understood enough. She returned to her chair and sat perfectly still, biting her lips so hard it left a mark. That night, after dinner, while Sadie and Stella argued over who got the bigger marshmallow in their cocoa, Skylar quietly began folding her clothes and stuffing them into her backpack. She didn't slam drawers or cry. She didn't say goodbye. She simply started to leave. Grayson found her by the door, sneakers on, coat zipped. "Where are you going?" he asked, voice low. She didn't meet his eyes. "We're leaving, right? Because she's sick. We can't stay if she's sick." Her voice cracked just once. Grayson's heart stilled in his chest. Grayson knelt, not because he had to, but because her eyes were too heavy with fear to meet from above. "Skylar," he said calmly. "No one is going anywhere." She shook her head. "But that's what happens. When people get sick, we leave. Or they leave. Or someone comes to take us." She blinked fast. "I've seen it before." He placed both hands on her backpack. "Not this time," he promised. "You're not leaving, and neither is your mom. Not unless it's together. Not unless it's your choice." That's when she looked at him. Her expression wasn't angry. It was older than any 5-year-old should carry. "You can't fix everything," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "No, but I can stay, and I can ask if I can help, and I can promise not to leave." She stood there, silent, until finally letting the straps fall off her shoulders. She didn't thank him, but she let him take the backpack and set it down. That was enough, for now. Later that evening, Grayson sat down with Elena, the folder of diagnoses between them like a fragile wall. She was already bracing for the conversation, her spine stiff, her eyes resigned. "Before you say anything," she began, "I know how this sounds, but I'm not letting anyone take them." He raised a brow. "That's not what I was going to say." He opened the folder, skimmed the top page again. "I was going to ask what we can do to make sure they don't lose you." She exhaled, the fight deflating just slightly. "I can't work during treatment." He nodded. "So you won't?" She flinched. "You think it's that easy?" He leaned forward. "No, I think it's that necessary." And then, cautiously, he said, "I want to offer shared custody. Legal. You keep them. But I can step in. School pickups, doctor visits, bedtime chaos. Whatever it takes." She stared at him like he'd grown another head. "You do that?" He looked down at his hands. "I already have, haven't I? Just without the paperwork." The words hung there, too real to ignore. That night, after Skylar had gone back to coloring, and Sadie was curled into his side, half asleep, and Stella was brushing a doll's hair with intense focus, Eleanor watched from the doorway. Something about how each of them leaned toward him, naturally, unconsciously, made her throat tighten. He hadn't taken their place. He had filled in the gaps without demanding a title. Sadie reached for his hand even while yawning. Stella whispered, "Daddy half," before dozing off. Elena covered her mouth with her hand, not to silence herself, but to hold in the ache that was both grief and gratitude. Grayson looked over, unsure, waiting. She didn't nod. She didn't smile. But she stepped into the room, sat beside him and whispered, "If I sign those papers, it's not because I'm giving them up." He replied instantly, "I'd never ask you to." Their eyes met. And for the first time, the idea of a family didn't feel so complicated. It just felt like possibility. By the time midnight came, the girls were fast asleep. Elena stood at the kitchen table, pen in hand, looking at the documents Grayson had printed hours earlier. She didn't sign yet. She just stared, then traced the names: Skylar Hale, Sadie Hale, Stella Hale, as if saying them on paper might make them real. Behind her, Grayson quietly placed 3 small pairs of shoes by the front door. Not because they had to be there, but because he hoped they always would. That night, a decision wasn't finalized, but a door was opened. Elena had heard Skylar's voice shake when she asked if they'd have to leave, and she had heard Grayson's voice, steady, sure, when he answered, "No one is going anywhere." In a world that had taught her not to believe, she found herself wanting just a little to trust that promise. Skylar sat cross-legged on the living room floor, chalk dust on her fingertips, carefully pressing down each line with quiet focus. She had chosen her colors on purpose: red, yellow, and blue. The stripes weren't perfect. One curved slightly, the others faded in parts. But to her, they meant something no adult could quite name. Grayson entered the room, slowing his steps when he saw her so intent. He didn't interrupt, just observed the way she drew with conviction, like the act itself mattered more than the result. Then, crouching beside her, he tilted his head and asked gently, "What are those, Sky?" She didn't look up right away. When she did, her eyes were calm, steady, and far older than they should have been. "They're not dirt anymore," she said, touching the red line softly. "They're the way." It wasn't just an answer, it was a declaration. He didn't ask her to explain. He didn't need to. Elena watched from the armchair, a thick wool blanket draped over her knees, the rise and fall of her chest more peaceful now, even with the lingering fatigue in her bones. She didn't speak either. The past weeks had stripped her of many things, certainty, fear, even pride, but in their place, something better had grown: trust. Skylar's voice echoed softly in the room, and Sadie, beside her on the carpet, held an open book, trying to read aloud but stumbling through a few words. And then the little bird said, I believe in you." Her voice quivered toward the end. Grayson turned his head toward her, smiled, and gave an exaggerated thumbs up. Sadie beamed, proud and bashful all at once. There was no need to correct her pronunciation. There were victories more important than fluency. Stella had fallen asleep earlier that afternoon and never moved from her spot on Grayson's lap. Her cheek was pressed against his chest, tiny fingers still clutching a piece of crayon she had forgotten to put down. Grayson didn't dare shift, even when his legs started to ache beneath her weight. He could feel the small rhythm of her breath and the way her body trusted his completely, without reservation or doubt. That kind of trust couldn't be asked for. It had to be earned. And quietly, steadily, that's what he'd been doing. Not through grand gestures or gifts, but by being present. By showing up when it mattered, by not leaving. His hand rested lightly on Stella's back, and with his free arm, he picked up one of Skylar's stray chalks and held it thoughtfully, as if he too wanted to draw something but didn't yet know how. No one was rushing to do anything. The silence in the room wasn't awkward, it was whole. Elena shifted slightly in her chair, brushing a tear from the corner of her eye, though she tried to do it without anyone noticing. But Grayson saw it. And for once, he didn't panic at the sight of someone else's vulnerability. He didn't rush to fix it. He simply met her gaze, and in that exchange said what no apology could: "I'm still here." She nodded. That was enough. It was enough that he hadn't disappeared again. Enough that the girls had their toothbrushes lined up, that dinner had vegetables and dessert, that their socks matched more days than not. It was enough that Skylar now said, "I'm tired," instead of pretending she wasn't. That Stella no longer woke up crying at night. That Sadie asked for bedtime stories again. Skylar picked up the blue chalk and added a small curved line above the 3 stripes. "That's the bridge," she told no one in particular, "so we don't get lost." Grayson leaned down closer and asked, "Can I help with the next one?" She looked at him for a long second, clearly deciding whether or not he meant it. Then she nodded. "You can draw the gate." He smiled, unsure how to draw a gate out of sidewalk chalk, but willing to try anyway. Elena chuckled under her breath and closed her eyes, not out of exhaustion this time, but out of something close to peace. For the first time in what felt like years, she wasn't preparing for what could go wrong. She was simply letting it be. Skylar sat back to admire her work, fingers smudged, knees dusted in color, and looked up at Grayson. "They're not dirt," she repeated, firmer now. "They're path." Grayson didn't question her wording. He understood. Outside, for the first time in weeks, the sky was clear. Sadie had curled up next to Elena now, the book still open but forgotten. Stella hadn't stirred, and in that room, simple, unadorned, untouched by scandal or noise, they existed not as pieces glued together by tragedy, but as something real, whole. Skylar rested her hand on the edge of her drawing. "It's how we know where to go," she whispered, and there, surrounded by drawings and quiet breaths, they were a family. Finally. We put a lot of care and heart into bringing each of these stories to life, thinking of you every step of the way. If this story moved you in any way, Take a moment to subscribe to our channel. It's the best way to help us continue creating stories that truly matter. And if you have a thought, a memory, or a feeling this video brought up, share it with us in the comments. We read everyone. Thank you for being here with us. You're not just watching, you're part of what makes this channel special.